everyone, and welcome to our latest podcast. My name is Kate Monserrate, and I'm one of the directors at Simplify Consulting. I'm joined by Carl Woodward, my fellow director, and Dom House, one of our lead consultants. So we're here to talk about the budget. Very interesting day yesterday, and we're covering it from two perspectives. So one, from a business owner's perspective, because obviously Carl and I own Simplify Consulting, and it's interesting to see the impacts on business owners, and secondly, from an industry perspective. So Dom, you're going to talk a little bit about the impacts on wealth. So Carl, firstly, to come to you, from an owner of a business, how was yesterday for you?
Well, it's definitely a generational budget, I think it's fair to say, and one that's been much trailed, particularly in the media, I guess, over the past 3 months. So it's probably one of the most highly anticipated budgets for some time. I think in the run-up, there's been lots of noise, obviously, about potential changes to employers' national insurance and where that might get levied, whether the rate would go up, whether the rate on employer pension contributions would also be included as part of the taxation rules, and lots of noise about CGT as well, and potentially the impact upon business asset disposal relief for business owners. And I guess there's quite a lot of nervousness, and in our own conversations with various people, founders looking at could they do a really quick sell before October to potentially avoid some of those tax hits. So in that regard, there were elements of yesterday that were slightly more depressed, I guess, than what we had anticipated and expected. A 1.2% increase in employers' national insurance. And I know there's been this rhetoric around not impacting working people. Businesses obviously are living in a really tough climate at the moment. Margins are forever squeezed. Typically, the marketplace hasn't been very buoyant across the board since coming out of the pandemic. And I think we're still facing into some of those post-pandemic issues. And obviously, government debt is running high and will continue to run high, and something needs to be done to plug some of those gaps. I think the challenge the government will face, and I think the OBR have since come out with their forecasts for future growth of the economy over the next few years, is that as a consequence of some of those decisions, particularly around taxation for employers, growth is actually likely to be slower and less than it would have been if we'd carried on with the same fiscal rules that were currently in place. So despite 40 billion increase in taxes, 30 billion pounds worth of spending, a mammoth budget, actually it's had a negative impact on the growth potential over the next few years. So that's quite interesting. I think it's also the consequential impacts of going and taxing employers. Now, obviously, the very smallest businesses that already benefit from some relief for the employer's allowance will benefit even further as a result of that going up. I think those medium-sized businesses and large businesses who employ lots of people in the UK and already pay significant sums of tax, whether that's corporation tax, VAT, business rates, employers' NI, obviously will now have to find a way of absorbing or passing on the additional increase in employers' NI in another way. Now, that will inevitably land at the feet of working people, because most of those businesses simply can't afford to absorb that impact on margins and impact on profits. Obviously, each organisation will have to look at how it does that. There will be some impacts in terms of the employment market, in terms of pay rises, in terms of capital expenditure and investment. How each organisation decides to fill that hole is going to be really interesting, and we'll have to watch this space to see the overall impact.
Some really difficult decisions, actually, aren't there? I think, like you say, as business owners, that was definitely the biggest impact from our perspective. So yeah, not a great day for us.
I was just going to mention in terms of the potential for inflationary pressures as a result of the budget as well. So don't know how the employers' national insurance increase will be passed on, could lead to increased prices from there. So obviously got quite a large increase in the national living wage as well, which potentially puts more money into people's pockets, but also could impact in terms of inflation, and therefore potentially on interest rates in the kind of medium term as well.
I think that's an interesting point, Dom. And if we do see that some employers elect not to give the pay rises perhaps they might have given without that increased taxation, actually wage inflation may not increase and may come down ever so slightly. Obviously, you have got the impact in hospitality, catering, those industries where there are more low pay employees who would get the benefit of an increase in the minimum wage and the living wage. But actually, the mid-tier, the people on salaried income who expect pay rises, maybe 4 or 5% inflation level pay rises year on year, if they don't get that, there may actually be an impact upon wage inflation that's positive for interest rates.
And Dom, what did you take away from the budget yesterday in terms of the impacts on the wealth industry?
So I think there were two big ticket items that came out. So the first one is the increase in the CGT rates at the higher rate and the lower rate. They're quite significant increases. So people who have assets that may wish to dispose of them will need to consider that. It may make ISAs more attractive to people, but the flip side of that is that the ISA rate has stayed the same for 10 years now, and the rate of inflation over that period has eroded the value of that subscription quite significantly. So there's no real sign of that changing in the near future. The other large area was the inheritance tax on pension assets coming into scope. So that's obviously going to impact a lot of people who are receiving assets from their loved ones' pensions. So there's obviously quite big changes there. There's some minor changes around the AIM shares, tax relief, etc. That need to be factored in. I think in general, we were expecting quite a significant shift towards kind of a wealth tax or a series of taxes that are targeted at people who own assets. I think on balance, it probably falls short of that. And obviously, as Carl said, the big tax raising measure was on the employer's NI, which I guess you could argue is on people who own assets, but that's another story. I think obviously the fact that there was so many kind of rumors and leaks over the last couple of weeks, as Carl mentioned, I think is a really interesting case. And this news cycle around the budget seems to have rolled on a lot longer than usual. Obviously, there's a change of government involved, etc. But we're just conscious that quite a lot of people were looking at those rumours and potentially taking action as a result of them. So people may have been looking at taking their tax-free lump sum from their pension in advance of a potential tax on that area, and that may have long-running implications for them and how they manage their assets going forward. So I think there's something that the industry needs to look at there and see how the old adage of sell the rumor, buy the fact is maybe apt in this case to make sure that you don't take actions that could then impact you if the rumor or the leak turns out not to be the case when it's announced.
Do you think, though, it's the industry that needs to look at that, or is it the government?
I thought we weren't going to get into politics too much, but yeah, I mean, obviously my feeling on this is that the Labour government were kind of what's the right word, but they were leaking certain things, testing the waters for certain things to see how it played out, what the reaction would be from the media, from the public or business owners, etc. That's not the best way of conducting policies, etc. I think they should have held their cards a bit closer to their chest, make sure that there is a clear direction that they're going to take. But they kind of painted themselves into a corner in a number of things. The idea that they weren't going to tax working people and the kind of the number of goes they had at defining what a working person was, and it just felt a little bit like they weren't quite sure which way they were going to go, and that obviously has put impacts on people.
It's really interesting, isn't it? I want to get your take, Dom, on There's been a narrative, I guess, over the past 2 to 3 months, going back to your point around the definition of a working person. Someone who has an asset isn't a working person. Someone who invests isn't a working person. The potential targeting of pension contributions, the actual inclusion of the pension and inheritance tax calculations. I guess the industry has worked really, really hard, hasn't it? And needs to do so much more to encourage people to invest, to not leave their disposable income sat in cash. How much do you think the government has maybe eroded some of that good work as a consequence of not necessarily policy, but the noise of the potential policy over the past few months?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because it's kind of giving with one hand and taking away with the other. And we know, and we've obviously done a lot of work around some of the challenges that the industry is trying to resolve in terms of getting more people to invest or understand investments more, whether that's in the advice gap or the amount of cash that's sat in kind of low interest accounts in the country, and the FCA's target to try and get people more involved in investing. I think when people see some of these changes being made by the government, it does counteract some of that good work. And I think, and without getting too much into this, we know that working people do invest. Everyone who has a pension is investing, and that comes from working. So then the government have to be pretty careful in terms of where they're going to target next. I think, like you said, Carl, there's obviously some investments needed in the economy. There's debt that needs to be serviced, etc. But trying to make it as fair and distributed evenly throughout the economy is a bit of a challenge, and I'm not sure the Labour government have got that quite right on this occasion.
I think maybe the theme of the budget is unintended consequences, perhaps. Any final thoughts from either of you?
It's an interesting one just around the national living wage increase. I was just looking earlier, and actually, based on that increase, if you're on national living wage, you'll trigger auto enrollment in pensions on 16 hours a week, which is quite an interesting one. Obviously, there's some benefits to people there, but there's also the impact of small pots based on quite part-time or flexible working arrangements. So that's just going to be an interesting one to see play out in the future.
Definitely.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd say is the spending commitments over the next 2 years are really significant. And after those 2 years actually start to fall back to something approaching normality. I think the spend in the NHS is forecast to be 1.3% uplift each year from years 3, 4, 5. And that's quite interesting. So what that implies is the impact of that significant investment in those public services over the next 2 years will be realised pretty quickly. We'll see the fruit of that investment pretty quickly in terms of really measurable things like waiting times and appointments and availability of GP appointments and investments in capital projects, some of those things that have been talked about for a long time. So I think in terms of judging and assessing this budget, it'll be really interesting because I think we'll get unusually a pretty quick insight into how effective it's been in addressing some of the challenges that have been in the economy for a number of years. And I think that's probably true across a number of areas of wealth as well. There's lots of other stuff happening at the same time, of course, around pension reviews and other aspects of regulatory and legislative policy changes. So I don't think you can just look at this budget in isolation, but obviously the impact of it will be felt pretty quickly, I think, by many.
Cool. Thank you both very much for your time and your views, and thank you to everyone for listening. If you want to get in touch with us or have a chat about anything you've heard today, give us a shout. We're online, www.simplifyconsulting.co.uk, and we'd be delighted to hear from you. Thanks very much.